There is a particular kind of rest that comes from a show you have already seen many times, and Rick and Morty offers it in a strange, specific way. You know the shape of the voices before the words arrive. Rick slurs and stammers through the same long sentences, that wet catch in his throat between thoughts, and Morty answers in that thin, worried register that never quite settles. You do not need to watch. You have watched. In the half-awake state, where the room goes soft and the mind lets go of its grip on the plot, the portal gun hums somewhere far off, and the garage fills with light, and none of it asks anything of you. It is enough to lie there and let the familiar chaos pass over you like weather you have already survived. Tonight moves slowly through a single question that hides underneath the noise of the first season. Consider every small moment, every offhand line and quiet inconsistency that suggests the grandfather asleep in the Smith family garage is not the Rick he appears to be. Think about what that question means for a man who abandoned his daughter for 20 years and returned without a word of where he had gone. The show gives no answer in the beginning. It simply sets the fact down and walks away from it, and the reason would not surface until a season 5 finale that aired nearly 8 years later. Welcome to Rick en Español. There is no hurry here, and nothing tonight requires you to keep your eyes open. Find the position you sleep in. Let the pillow take the weight of your head, and let your breathing slow to match the pace of a calm and patient voice. The clues will be laid out one at a time, gently, in order, so that if you drift and return, you will still be able to follow. Settle in, and let the evening carry you. There is a version of Rick and Morty that most people carry in their heads, and it is loud, and it is fast, and it is soaked in green portal light. But the beginning of the story is quieter than that, and stranger, and it hides its strangeness in plain sight. To understand what the series is really about, you have to go back to the very first episode, the one simply called the pilot, and you have to look at what it tells you, and, more importantly, at what it refuses to tell you. The pilot premiered on Adult Swim on the 2nd of December 2013. It drew roughly 1.1 million viewers on that first broadcast, which is a modest number, the number of a show that nobody yet knew to be waiting for. It was written by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, and directed by Justin Roiland, and in a detail that tells you something about the intimacy of the whole enterprise, Roiland provided the voice of both Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith. The old man and the boy, the scientist and the grandson, dragged along behind him, came out of the same throat. Think about what that means for a moment. The two central figures of the series, the ones whose relationship the entire thing orbits, were from the first breath a single performer talking to himself. The episode that these two men made together opens on an adventure, or something that wants to look like one. Rick takes Morty to another dimension in order to obtain seeds for what the series calls a megatree. That is the plot on the surface, the errand, the thing that gives the characters somewhere to be. And already, if you are listening closely, there is a small wrongness in it. A grandfather has taken his grandson out of the ordinary world and into another dimension entirely, to gather seeds, and the boy is going along with it, and this is presented as a more or less normal Tuesday in this household. The adventure is real, but the adventure is not the point. The point is underneath. Because back at the house, while Rick and Morty are off between dimensions, the boy's parents are having a conversation about the old man. Jerry and Beth, the mother and father, are considering putting Rick in a retirement home. That is the domestic engine of the pilot, quieter than the sci-fi and far more revealing. They want him gone, or at least they are weighing it, and the show is careful to give you their stated reason. The reason they consider the retirement home is that Rick has been keeping Morty away from school in order to help him in his lab. That is the grievance on the table. The grandfather is a bad influence, a disruptor of routine, a man who steals a child from his classroom to serve as a lab assistant. Notice how reasonable that sounds. Notice, too, how thin it is. A retirement home is not the ordinary consequence of a grandfather being too involved, too demanding, too much. It is what a family reaches for when a person has become a problem they do not know how to hold. The stated reason and the proposed solution do not quite match in size, and that small mismatch is the first thread you can pull. The parents have gone well past annoyance. There is a pressure in that house, a wish to be rid of him, and the school excuse feels almost like the acceptable version of something they cannot fully name. To feel the weight of that pressure, you need the piece of backstory the pilot hands you almost casually. According to the episode's documented plot, Rick had abandoned his adult daughter Beth for 20 years before the events we are watching. 20 years, and by the time the pilot takes place, Rick has only just moved back in with the Smith family, and the show never says exactly how long it has been. So the arrangement we are looking at is brand new. This is not a grandfather who has always been around, softening over decades into a fixture. This is a man who vanished from his daughter's life for 2 decades and then, 1 year ago, reappeared and moved into her home. The seed gathering, the lab, the boy pulled out of school, all of it is happening in the first year of a reunion that came after a 20-year silence. Sit with the shape of that. A daughter grows up without her father. She becomes an adult, marries, has children, builds an entire life across 20 years in which the man is simply absent. And then he comes back, and he moves in, and within a year he is taking her son to other dimensions and keeping him out of school, and she and her husband are privately discussing whether he belongs in a home. The strained dynamic in that house is not a mystery, the way a locked door is a mystery. It is the entirely earned residue of an abandonment. Of course it is strained. He left. And here is where the pilot does the most interesting thing it does, which is almost nothing at all. The plot summary of that first episode contains no explanation of where Rick was during those 20 years, or what he was doing. It is not offered as a puzzle to be solved by the end of the half hour, nor a case the episode opens and closes. The absence is simply stated, dropped in as a fact about the character, the way you might be told that a man walks with a limp. He was gone for 20 years, that is all. The series introduces the single most consequential fact of Rick's biography, and then declines to account for it. And it does this so smoothly that on a first watch, you may not even register that a question has been left open. You are too busy with the seeds and the other dimension and the retirement home to notice that the largest thing in the room has no explanation attached to it. This is worth dwelling on, because it is a genuine choice, and a bold one, and it is the kind of thing that separates a show built to last from a show built for a single night. Most series that hand you a 20-year absence in the first episode do so because they intend to spend the season pulling the thread, doling out the reason in careful pieces, rewarding your patience. The pilot does not do that. It plants the absence and then walks away from it, letting the wrongness sit there, unexplained, structural, a permanent tilt in the floor of the whole family. And it trusts that the tilt itself is more interesting than any single answer would be. The critics of the time felt the tilt even if they could not have named where it would lead. The AV Club gave the pilot a B+, and in its praise it reached for a specific phrase. It praised the episode's dark implications. That is a careful thing for a review to say about what looks, on its surface, like a crude cartoon about a drunk scientist and his nervous grandson. Dark implications. Not dark events, not dark jokes, but implications. The sense of something suggested and not shown, something under the floorboards. The reviewer was responding, whether consciously or not, to exactly the thing we have been circling. The pilot implies far more than it states. The 20 missing years are the deepest of those implications, a darkness the episode gestures at and refuses to illuminate. To understand how deliberate this restraint was, it helps to know where these characters came from, because they did not begin as literary figures at all. Rick and Morty originated in a short film Justin Roiland made in 2006, called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. It was a deliberately crude parody of Back to the Future, made for a short film festival called Channel 101, and in it, Roiland voiced twisted versions of Doc Brown and Marty McFly. That is the primordial form of these two. A rude little joke about a science fiction grandfather and the boy he drags around, made cheaply and quickly for a festival crowd. There is nothing in that origin that promises a meditation on abandonment and grief. The characters were a gag before they were anything else. What turned the gag into a series was a meeting. Dan Harmon, who had previously created the sitcom Community, met Justin Roiland through that same festival, Channel 101, which Harmon had co-founded. So the collaboration that produced the pilot was the collision of two sensibilities. One man had built these characters as crude parody, and the other man arrived from the world of carefully structured television comedy, a builder of long-running story machines. And what the two of them made together, in that first episode, kept the crudeness on the surface and buried something patient and withholding underneath it. The choice to state the 20-year absence and leave it unexplained is precisely the kind of choice that a parody would never bother to make, and that a serious storyteller makes on purpose. It is a hook set deep and left to wait. And wait it did, longer than almost anyone watching in 2013 could have guessed. The reason for Rick's 20-year absence was not revealed on the series until the Season 5 finale, an episode called Rickmurai Jack, which aired in September of 2021. Do the arithmetic gently. That is nearly 8 years after the pilot premiered. For 8 years, the largest unexplained fact in the character's life stayed unexplained on screen, exactly as the pilot had left it. The show carried that silence across 5 seasons before it chose to break it. Whatever else you want to say about Rick and Morty, that is remarkable discipline for a series that on its surface behaves as though it has no discipline at all. When the answer finally came in Rickmurai Jack, it recolored everything behind it. The finale revealed that this Rick's original wife, named Diane, and his original daughter, also named Beth, were killed by an alternate version of himself, a figure the series calls Rick Prime. And it revealed that this Rick, the one we have been watching all along, eventually crash-landed into the garage of a different dimension's Beth, a variant of the daughter he had lost, and took up residence with her family instead of his own dead one. Hold that against the pilot and feel it change. The strained family we met in the first episode is not his family in the deepest sense. The Beth whose home he moved into 1 year before the pilot is a version of a daughter he could not save. The absence, the abandonment, the 20 years, all of it now reads as the long shadow of a murder, and a man drifting through dimensions in the wreckage of it. But you must not let the later answer flatten the first episode, because the first episode did not have that answer, and its power comes precisely from not having it. In the pilot, there is no Diane, no Rick Prime, no crash into the garage. There is only a man who left his daughter for 20 years, who came back 1 year ago, who takes her son to other dimensions for seeds, and whose presence has strained the household to the point that his own child is considering a retirement home for him. There is only the absence, stated and unexplained, and the dark implications a careful reviewer felt radiating off of it. That is the founding mystery of the series, and it is a mystery the show itself set on purpose and then refused to solve for nearly 8 years. Everything that follows, every dimension, every version of these people, grows out of that first quiet wrongness in the Smith family home, the sense, planted in the very first episode, that there is something not quite explained about this Rick. There is a particular kind of story that begins with something small and ordinary, a boy who wants a girl at school to notice him, and ends with the quiet burial of 2 bodies in a backyard. The 6th episode of the first season of Rick and Morty is that story. It is called Rick Potion Number 9, and when it first aired on Adult Swim on the 27th of January in the year 2014, it drew somewhere around 1.7 million viewers, most of whom had settled in for another loud, inventive half-hour of science fiction comedy. What they received instead was one of the more devastating episodes the series would ever produce, an episode that would go on to hold a rating of 9.1 out of 10 from users on IMDb, and one that begins, as so many catastrophes do, with a favor. The favor is simple. Morty has a crush on a girl named Jessica, and he wants her to notice him at school. So he asks his grandfather Rick for help, and Rick, in the careless, offhand way he tends to grant these requests, creates a love potion. Think about the modesty of the request for a moment. There is no ambition in it, no greed, nothing that reaches beyond the small and universal wish to be seen by someone you like. That is the seed from which everything grows. A love potion, made to solve the smallest problem a teenager can have. But there is a detail that Rick either does not know or does not bother to account for, and the detail is this. Jessica has the flu. When Morty gives her the potion, the love serum does something its maker never intended. It bonds with the influenza virus already living in her body, And in that bonding, something that was meant to be a private affection becomes something contagious. This is the pivot of the whole episode, and it is worth sitting with because it turns Morty's desire into a disease. Love, engineered and then infected, stops being a feeling and becomes a thing that spreads. And spread it does. The love virus moves through the population globally, and almost the entire world falls obsessively in love with Morty. This is obsession, the kind that fixes every eye in the world on a single frightened boy. The only people spared are his immediate family, and there is a cruel logic to that exemption, because it means Morty must watch the entire planet lose itself over him, while the handful of people who actually know him remain untouched. Everyone who does not know him wants him. Everyone who does is immune. That is the shape of the disaster in its first stage, and it is already grotesque. An entire species reorganized around one child's accidental gravity. Rick, faced with what he has made, does what Rick always does. He attempts to fix it. His first antidote uses praying mantis DNA, and here the episode begins its slow, patient descent into horror. The antidote does not cure anyone. Instead, it turns the infected population into human mantis hybrids, creatures that no longer merely love Morty, but try to mate with him and to consume him, because in the praying mantis those two impulses, mating and devouring, are the same act. Consider the escalation. The love that began as a wish to be noticed has now become a world of predators that want to hold Morty and eat him in the same motion. Each attempt to make things better has made them stranger and more dangerous, and Rick is only getting started. The second attempted fix is worse. Rather than reversing the mantis mutation, it deepens it, warping the mantis people into disfigured monsters, misshapen and ruined things that no longer resemble anything human or insect. Rick gives them a name. He calls them Cronenbergs. The name is not arbitrary, and it is worth understanding where it comes from, because the writers chose it with care. It is a direct reference to David Cronenberg, the Canadian director who pioneered the genre known as body horror, the filmmaker behind works like The Fly and Videodrome, films obsessed with flesh that changes, bodies that betray themselves, the human form turning into something it was never meant to be. To name these monsters Cronenbergs is to announce exactly what kind of horror this is. It is not the horror of a threat from outside. It is the horror of the body itself becoming wrong. So now the world is full of Cronenbergs, and there is a question that hangs over the middle of the episode. The question of whether Rick can undo any of this. And here the story does something that comedies almost never do. It refuses the reset. Rick declares the Earth unsalvageable. He does not try a third fix, does not stay up all night at his workbench inventing a clever reversal. Instead, he looks at what he has done, decides it cannot be cured, and chooses to abandon the dimension entirely. Understand what that means. There is no undo button. The world is broken, and rather than repair it, Rick decides to leave it. But leaving is not as simple as walking out a door, and the mechanism Rick chooses is the darkest idea in the episode. He scans the multiverse, searching not for a cure, but for a replacement. Specifically, he searches for an alternate dimension where counterpart versions of himself and Morty had already faced an equivalent Cronenberg-style crisis and had already solved it. He is not looking for help. He is looking for a vacancy, a version of his own life that has been cleaned up in advance and left empty enough to move into. He finds one. Later wiki material would catalog it as Dimension C-131, and the crucial fact about this dimension is what happened to its residents. In that world, the local Rick and the local Morty did solve their version of the disaster, and then, shortly after, they died. The house is standing, the family is intact, the crisis is over, and the two people who fixed it are gone, leaving behind a life with a Rick-shaped hole and a Morty-shaped hole in it. This is what Rick was scanning for. Not a solution to his problem, but a grave he could stand in. What follows is, in the plainest possible terms, the emotional floor of the whole series, and the series stages it without music swelling or speeches given. Rick and Morty travel to Dimension C-131, and they bury the corpses of their dead alternate dimension counterparts in the backyard. Sit with the physical fact of it. The two of them, the versions we have been following, dig holes in the ground and lay their own dead bodies into the earth. The bodies of a Rick and a Morty who are, in every way that matters, themselves. And then, having buried themselves, they quietly take their place in that family's life. They walk into the house. They sit down at the table. They become the Rick and Morty that this family lost. And the family does not know the difference, because there is no difference to know. The episode does not let Morty off easily in its final image. He walks back into the new house with a blank, shell-shocked stare, and he sits down on the couch in silence. That is the closing note. Not a joke, not a lesson, but a boy who has just buried his own corpse and traded his ruined world for a stranger's intact one, sitting silently on a couch, staring at nothing. Everything that has happened has passed through him and left him empty. He wanted a girl to notice him. Now he is a fugitive from his own dimension, wearing the life of a dead boy who wore his own face, and there is nothing to say. This is where the story of the two of them ends, but the episode has two more things to show us, and both arrive in the post-credits scene, and both are essential to understanding what the abandonment actually costs and does not cost. The first is a return to the dimension they left. Jerry, Beth, and Summer are shown as the only unmutated humans remaining in the abandoned original world, surrounded by the Cronenberg-infested ruin of everything they knew. They have lost their home, their neighbors, their entire reality. And in this scene, Jerry and Beth admit that they are happier without Rick and Morty, while Summer, lost in her own performance, reenacts a scene from Jaws. Consider the weight of that admission. The two characters we follow, the ones whose adventure this is, are revealed to be a subtraction from the lives of the people they left behind. Their absence is an improvement. The father, the mother, the sister, stranded in a monster-choked wasteland, and the thing they name as making it bearable is that the grandfather and the boy are gone. The second thing the post-credit scene shows is stranger and, in its way, almost cruel in its timing. Cronenberg versions of Rick and Morty step through a portal, arriving from yet another dimension. And the reason they are there is that their Cronenberg Rick had accidentally cured his world's population back to normal. Let that fact land against everything that came before. In the story we watched, our Rick tried twice to fix the disease and only made it worse, and finally declared the whole world beyond saving and walked away from it. And here, in the final seconds, we learn that in another branch of the multiverse, a Rick fixed the very same catastrophe by accident. The cure was possible. It simply was not possible for the Rick we were following, or perhaps it was possible and he did not find it, and the difference between a saved world and a buried one turns out to be a matter of which Rick you happen to be. There is a lot to hold in that, and I want to be careful to keep the interpretation separate from the facts, because the facts are strong enough on their own. But it is fair to say, I think, that the episode is built around a single idea rendered as literally as an animated show can render it, and the idea is the act of leaving one family behind for another. Morty's family in the original dimension is left behind, alive but abandoned in a ruined world, and they are glad of it. Morty's family in the new dimension is inherited, taken over, occupied like an empty house. The love potion that started everything was a machine for making people care about Morty, and by the end, the machinery of the plot has delivered him into a family that has no idea who he is, and a family that is happier that he is gone. The wish to be noticed curdles into the condition of being fundamentally interchangeable, one Morty for another, buried and replaced. It is easy, watching this episode late at night, to be struck by how much it refuses to comfort you. Most stories about a mistake this large would find a way to earn the fix, to make the hero work for the reversal and deserve it. This one gives the reversal to someone else, in another dimension, by accident, and shows it to you only after our Rick and Morty have already given up and moved into a dead family's home. The comedy of the series, its speed and its irreverence, is all still present in the setup. In the casual way Rick tosses off a love potion for a school crush. But the episode uses that lightness as a way in, and once you are inside, it closes the door and shows you a boy sitting silently on a couch, unable to look at anything. The people who made it knew what they were doing. Rick Potion Number 9 was written by Justin Roiland and directed by Steven Sandoval, and it stands as the 6th entry in the first season, the point at which the series informed its audience that the multiverse it kept joking about had teeth. The premise that there are infinite dimensions is, in most episodes, an engine for adventure and for jokes, a way to have any adventure at all with no permanent consequence. This episode takes the same premise and turns it into the source of the horror. If there are infinite Ricks and infinite Mortys, then no single Rick and no single Morty is irreplaceable, and a Rick who ruins his world can simply find one that is already fixed and step into it, leaving his own dead selves in the ground behind him. The freedom of infinite worlds and the horror of infinite worlds turn out to be the same fact seen from two sides. And so the small favor, the love potion made so a boy could be noticed by a girl with the flu, becomes the thing that unmakes a world. Every stage of the disaster follows from the one before it, with a terrible logic. The potion bonds with the virus. The virus becomes global love. The love becomes mantis hunger. The hunger becomes Cronenberg ruin. The ruin becomes unsalvageable, and the unsalvageable becomes abandonment, and the abandonment becomes two bodies in a backyard and a family that never knows it has been replaced. There is no villain in any of it, only a grandfather being careless and a boy being hopeful, and the machinery of consequence turning those two small things into the end of a world. When Morty sits down on that couch and stares at nothing, he is sitting in a house that is not his, in a dimension that is not his, having buried a version of himself in the yard outside, while somewhere behind him his real family stands happier in the wreckage he left. The episode does not tell you how to feel about that. It simply shows it to you, calmly, in the last minutes before the credits, and then it shows you that the whole thing could have been avoided by another Rick who got lucky, and then it lets you go. It is a strange thing to fall asleep to, and yet there is something in its refusal to console that settles the mind rather than agitating it. The way a story told honestly, all the way to its unhappy end, can be more restful than one that lies to you and promises everything will be put back the way it was. There is a moment in the 3rd season that closes a loop the series opened in its first year, and to understand it you have to go back to an episode called Rick Potion Number 9, the 6th of Season 1. In that episode, Rick brews a mutagen, and the mutagen does not do what he intends. Instead of solving Morty's small teenage problem, it spreads across nearly the entire planet, turning almost every human being on Earth into a writhing mass of flesh, the creature's fans came to call Cronenbergs, while by sheer chance Jerry, Beth, and Summer are left untouched. Rick tries to fix it. He fails. The Earth is ruined, irreversibly, and there is nothing left to do but leave. So Rick and Morty leave. Rick opens a portal to another dimension, one that is almost identical to their own, and the reason he chooses this particular dimension is chilling in its practicality. In that alternate world, a Rick and a Morty had faced the exact same catastrophe, the same mutagen, the same threat to the same planet, and they had solved it. They had saved their Earth. And then, in the aftermath, they had died. The version of Rick that our Rick has been living beside is not the version who was born into the family we watch. He is a refugee from a dead world, stepping into the still warm life of a man who succeeded where he failed. Think about what that requires. When Rick and Morty arrive in this new dimension, the bodies of its original Rick and Morty are lying there, freshly dead. And so the two of them do something that the series presents without flinching. They carry the corpses of their dead counterparts into the family's backyard, and they bury them there, in the ground behind the house, in what by most accounts becomes just another patch of grass in a yard the family goes on using like nothing ever happened. Then they step through the door and simply take over. They sit at the table. They answer to the same names. They become, from that point forward, the Rick and the Morty we follow for the rest of the series. The family never knows. The switch is total, and it is silent. The bookkeeping of this is worth holding on to, because the show is precise about it even when it is casual. The dimension they abandoned, the one drowning in Cronenberg flesh, carries a label of its own, and it is not the same one they arrive in. The dimension they relocated into, the one with the graves in the backyard, is designated C131. These are not interchangeable labels. One is a graveyard of a planet, the other is a borrowed life. And the Rick that the multiverse itself came to call the Rickest Rick, the one who fled that ruined world behind, is technically standing in a house that is not his, in a world that is not his, wearing the place of a man he put in the dirt. There is a detail from the abandoned dimension that lingers, and it belongs to that dimension alone, so I want to keep it there. At the end of Rick Potion number 9, before our Rick and Morty flee, we see what becomes of the people left behind in the abandoned dimension. Jerry and Beth are among the only unmutated humans still standing, alongside Summer, and in the wreckage of everything they say something devastating. They admit to each other that they are happier this way, happier with Rick gone, happier with their own Morty gone. The world has ended around them, and their honest confession is a kind of relief. That is the family our Rick walked away from. He did not leave behind a grieving household. He left behind 2 people exhaling. For 2.5 seasons, that is where the matter rests. The dimension swap is one of the darkest things the series ever did, and then it goes largely unspoken, folded into the background of a series that keeps moving forward. A casual viewer could easily forget it, or half remember it as a strange one-off. The series lets you forget, and then it decides to remind you, deliberately, in the place you would least expect to have your stomach turned. The reminder comes in the Rick Shank Redemption, the premiere of Season 3. The circumstances are these. Rick has been captured by the Galactic Federation and is being held in prison, and back on Earth, now under Federation control, the family is left without him. The episode's own opening sets this tension plainly. Rick sits in galactic prison working an escape plan, while on Earth Morty and Summer argue with each other about their grandfather, about who he is and whether he is worth saving. Summer wants to save him, and Summer, being resourceful and stubborn in the way the show has taught her to be, comes up with a plan to do it. Her plan is where the loop closes. Summer needs a portal gun to reach Rick, and she knows exactly where one is. She goes into the backyard and she digs. What she is digging for is the corpse of this dimension's original Rick, the one who died and was buried there when our Rick took his place. And what she is after, specifically, is that dead Rick's portal gun, still intact after all this time in the ground. She exhumes the body, she retrieves the device, and she means to use it to break her grandfather out of Federation custody. Sit with the mechanics of that scene for a moment, because they are genuinely astonishing. The series has buried a piece of evidence, literally, in the backyard, and it has left it buried there for over 2 seasons. When Summer's shovel finds it, the series is not inventing a new fact. It is confirming an old one. There is a dead Rick under that lawn. There has always been a dead Rick under that lawn. The premiere simply hands you the shovel and lets you watch the dirt come up. It is one of the more elegant pieces of long-form storytelling the series ever attempted, an answer to a question most viewers had stopped asking. And the series is not finished making the point. Morty does not want Summer to go through with the rescue, and to talk her out of it, he does something that turns the whole history into a single image. He opens a portal, and he takes her through it, back to the abandoned dimension, the Cronenberg world their original Rick left in ruins. He shows it to her directly. This is what he wants her to see: the devastation, the consequence, the actual cost of the man she is trying to save, standing there in front of her in the flesh of a wrecked planet. He is telling her, in effect, that this is who Rick is, and this is what following Rick can do. The graves in the backyard and the ruined dimension are 2 ends of the same story, and Morty places his sister between them. Critics writing about the premiere at the time noticed exactly what the show was doing. Reviewers of the Rick Shank Redemption identified the backyard grave and the exhumed portal gun as a direct, deliberate callback to the dimension swap from Rick Potion number 9, reaching back across more than 2 seasons to pay off a thread that had been waiting. This was not read as coincidence or as a writer's convenient shortcut. It was understood as design, as the series demonstrating that it remembered its own darkest choice and intended for you to remember it too. There is one more piece of context that belongs to the real world rather than to the story, and it says something about how confident the series was in this material. The Rick Shank Redemption aired on the 1st of April 2017, and it aired as a surprise. Adult Swim released it that very day with no warning at all, and only much later, once the surprise had already aired, did the network reveal when the rest of the season would actually follow. The premiere that reopened the grave in the backyard arrived unannounced, dropped onto viewers who had spent years wondering whether the show would ever return to the swap or let it fade. It returned to it, and it did so as concretely as possible. A shovel, a body, a working portal gun pulled out of the earth. So the smoking gun, if you want to call it that, is not a line of dialogue or a theory stitched together from hints. It is a corpse. The Rick and Morty we have watched all this time are the ones who buried the originals and took their place, and the Season 3 premiere confirms it directly, by digging one of those originals back up. There is a common memory of this show that places the Citadel of Ricks in Morty Night Run, the second episode of the second season, and it is worth pausing on how confidently that memory misfires. Morty Night Run does something else entirely. Its story centers on Jerry Boree, a daycare built to hold the alternate dimension Jerrys that Ricks drop off before their adventures, and on Morty going out alone to stop an assassin named Krombopulos Michael. The Citadel is not introduced there. It arrives earlier, in the second-to-last episode of the first season, in the episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. And the difference matters, because the idea we are tracing in this series, the slow erosion of any single true Rick, is born in that earlier hour, and not the one people tend to name. So set aside the false start and go back to where the thing actually begins. In that second-to-last episode of the first season, the Rick we have been following, the one designated Rick of Dimension C-137, is arrested and put on trial by the Transdimensional Council of Ricks. The charge is enormous. He stands accused of murdering 27 other Ricks and kidnapping their Mortys, and the evidence against him seems damning until, over the course of the episode, it is shown to be fabricated. Think about what a strange sentence that is to even say aloud. A council of Ricks accuses a Rick of murdering Ricks, and everyone in the room is, in some literal sense, the same man. The trial is not a man against society, it is a man against a courtroom full of himself. The setting for all of this is the Citadel, and in this first appearance it is drawn as something almost tender in its premise. It is presented as an interdimensional sanctuary, a place housing countless Rick and Morty variants who fled their home timelines together and gathered somewhere outside the ordinary map. Picture the logic of that. Across the multiverse, enormous numbers of these two figures, the brilliant grandfather and the anxious boy, decided at some point that their own realities were not worth staying in, and they left, and they found each other, and they built a city out of the leaving. It is a sanctuary founded on flight. That founding detail will matter more and more as the seasons go on, because a refuge built by people running away tends to carry the thing they were running from inside it. The episode does not let the sanctuary stay warm for long. The murderous figure at the center of the case, the one the series calls Evil Rick, turns out not to be an author of anything. The twist reveals that this Evil Rick was a mindless cyborg, remotely controlled by another figure entirely, a Morty, through a device hidden in his eye patch. This is Evil Morty, and once the control is exposed, he removes the eye patch, destroys it, and disappears into the crowd of Mortys around him. Hold that image, because it is one of the quietest and most important gestures in the whole series. The most dangerous mind in the room is not a Rick at all. It is a Morty, and when he wants to vanish, he does the one thing this world makes effortless. He steps into a crowd of faces identical to his own and is gone. Now consider the name at the center of all this, the designation that supposedly anchors our hero, Rick Sanchez, of the world logged as C-137. It sounds like an identity. It behaves like one across the series. Fans use it as a proper name, the way you would use a surname, but look at what it actually is. It is a dimensional coordinate, an arbitrary address, a label pointing at a location rather than describing a soul. The show never explains on screen what C-137 is supposed to stand for. There is no decoded meaning, no revealed significance behind those characters. Our Rick is distinguished from the infinite others not by anything essential, not by virtue or origin or destiny, but by a filing number. That is the first crack. If the only thing separating your Rick from the crowd of Ricks is a coordinate that means nothing in particular, then the word real starts to lose its footing. The series returns to the Citadel later, in the third season, in the episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, and by then the sanctuary has grown into something with a full and painful society. No longer a hall of council members and a courtroom, it has become a working civilization with economic class divisions, and the series is unsparing about them. Many Ricks labor on assembly lines, working factory jobs at a place that makes simple Ricks wafer cookies, while other Ricks live above them as police, as judges, as government officials. Let that settle for a moment. Every one of these figures is the smartest being in his own universe. A man who in his home reality bends physics to his will, and here, gathered together, they have sorted themselves into bosses and workers, rulers and ruled. Genius does not save them from hierarchy. Put enough of the same brilliant man in one place, and he will build a class system, and then take his own place near the bottom of it. Inside that system, the episode follows a factory worker, a Rick designated J22, who is passed over for a promotion. He goes on a violent rampage, and then, in the cruelest turn, he is manipulated by the factory owner, a Rick called Rick Sanchez III, who exploits J22's raw emotions in order to flavor the cookies. Sit with the horror underneath the joke. The suffering of a worker, Rick becomes literally the product. His despair is harvested and sold as a taste. And the man doing the harvesting is himself a Rick, differing from his victim by nothing that either of them could point to and call fundamental. The cruelty here is not one species preying on another. It is a man monetizing his own grief by finding a copy of himself who feels it more openly. The Ricklantis mix-up ends by pulling the whole structure inside out. The Citadel holds an election, and the newly and democratically chosen president turns out to be Evil Morty, the same figure who slipped away into the crowd 2 seasons earlier. Once in power, he moves against the machinery that had actually been running the place, a secret body called the Shadow Council of Ricks, which had governed the Citadel from the shadows, and he has every member of it executed. Follow the shape of that arc. A Morty who once hid himself among identical Mortys now stands at the top of a city of Ricks, having won it by vote, and his first act is to erase the hidden Ricks who thought they were in charge. The sanctuary the Ricks built for themselves has been quietly taken from them by the one figure they were built to overshadow. It helps in understanding what the Citadel used to be to know how narrow its government once was. According to the Rick and Morty wiki, the Citadel's original governing council, the body that ruled before its fall, consisted of only 6 Ricks, with one of them, a Rick named Rick IV, serving as spokesman. 6. Out of an uncountable population, 6 of them held the gavel, and one of them did the talking. That is worth holding beside the later image of the factory floor and the wafer cookies, because it shows the same pattern at both ends. Even at the top, even among the founders, the many were spoken for by the very few, and the arrangement was already a hierarchy pretending to be a brotherhood. And then, in the first episode of the 6th season, the one called Solarix, the show takes the final step and removes the ground from under our own Rick specifically. It is revealed that Rick C137 is not the original, not the mightiest, not the source. There is another individual, called Rick Prime, from the dimension the series calls Prime, which is the Cronenberged world glimpsed in the very first season. Rick Prime is the one who murdered our Rick's wife, Diane, and his daughter, Beth, years before anything we have watched. That murder is the wound underneath the whole character, and it was dealt by a different Rick entirely. In the aftermath, our Rick left his own ruined home dimension, and by most fan reconstructions of the show's tangled dimension hopping, the family he ended up raising was not even Rick Prime's own, but a different family entirely. Which means the man we have followed since the first season, the man we call the real one, is explicitly not the Rick tied to the Prime designation. He is living in another Rick's house, raising another Rick's family, carrying a grief that another Rick caused. So the question the whole show has been circling turns out to have a strange and honest answer. There is no real Rick, only a Rick the camera decided to follow, marked off from the rest by a coordinate that means nothing, seated inside a life that was not originally his. The Citadel simply makes visible what the naming always implied. Multiply the man endlessly, and you do not find the true one hiding among the copies. You find only that the word true was never doing the work you thought it was. There is a moment near the beginning of this story that most viewers barely register, and yet it functions like a door softly closing. Rick and Morty, our Rick and Morty, encounter a visiting Rick and Morty from the Citadel of Ricks. The exchange is brief, and then our two, the pair whose story the series usually follows, head off on an adventure to Atlantis, an adventure we never see. Consider what that means. The camera does not follow the characters we know. It stays behind with the strangers, and it lets the ones we care about walk out of frame towards something the series refuses to show us. Almost the entire episode belongs to people we have never met, all of whom are, in some sense, the very people we just watched leave. This is the episode called, on its on-screen title card, Tales from the Citadel. Most of the world knows it by a different name, the Ricklantis Mix-Up, and the gap between those two titles is its own small joke. The name we use, the Ricklantis Mix-Up, points at the Atlantis adventure, the one that never appears. The name on the screen points at what we actually get, the tales of the Citadel itself. It is as if the episode is gently correcting the marketing, insisting that the story is not the one you were promised. The trip to Atlantis is the bait. The Citadel is the substance. To understand why this episode carries the weight it does, it helps to remember where the Citadel of Ricks came from. It was first introduced during the first season, a place built by countless versions of Rick Sanchez from countless realities, a bureaucratic haven for a man who supposedly answers to no one. The Ricklantis Mix-Up is a standalone sequel to that earlier episode, and you can watch it cold, without much memory of the original, and still follow every thread. That is part of its design. It does not require homework. It simply drops you into a civilization made entirely of duplicates and asks you to notice how quickly the duplicates begin to differ from one another. The Citadel we return to is not the one we left. This episode depicts it in the middle of rebuilding, recovering from a wound. In the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick Sanchez, one particular Rick, nearly destroyed the entire place. So the society we walk through here is convalescent. It is patching its own holes. And there is something almost unbearably human in watching a city of gods rebuild after one of their own tore it apart. Because it means these near-omnipotent beings have to live with consequences, have to sweep up the rubble, have to keep the lights on for the ordinary Ricks and the ordinary Mortys who never asked to be born into a machine this large. Here is where the chapter's true subject comes into focus. The question the episode circles without ever stating aloud. If everyone is a Rick, then what is a Rick worth? If any Morty can be swapped for any other Morty, then does the individual matter at all? Or is a person on the Citadel simply a role waiting to be filled by the next identical body? The genius of the writing is that it does not answer this with a speech. It answers it with structure. It gives you several separate stories running in parallel, and in each one it subtly tests whether identity or replaceability is the deeper truth of this place. You feel it in the texture of the crowd. On the Citadel there are Ricks who are cops and Mortys who are their partners, Ricks who run for office, Ricks who work factory floors, Mortys who go to school and are sorted and told what they will become. Every one of these characters is, technically, the same two people copied endlessly. And yet the episode insists, gently and then not so gently, that copying does not produce sameness. A Rick raised into drudgery is not the Rick we know. A Morty who has been ground down by a system built in his own image is a specific Morty, with a specific ache. Replaceability is the official lie of the Citadel. Individuality is the fact it keeps failing to suppress. A large part of why this illusion holds together, on a purely technical level, is a single voice. Justin Roiland voiced nearly every Rick and Morty clone character who appears in the episode. Sit with that. Society, a whole spread of cops and candidates and students and workers, spoken into being by one performer moving between them. In a story about whether individuals are interchangeable, the production itself enacts the paradox. One person supplies dozens of distinct people, and somehow they do read as distinct, each with a slightly different weariness or ambition or fear. The sameness is literally true, one actor, one source, and the difference is just as literally true because you can tell them apart. The episode is arguing its theme through its own making. There are two other voices worth naming, because they cut against that wall of Roiland and, in doing so, mark the moments the episode wants you to feel most sharply. Sarah Chalke, who plays Beth Sanchez elsewhere in the series, voiced a young version of Beth for a single line here. One line, one different voice, a small human note dropped into a city of clones. And Jeff B. Davis provided the narration for an in-universe commercial, an advertisement for something called Simple Rick's Wafers that plays inside the world of the series. That commercial voice, warm and practiced in the way commercial voices always are, sells a product built on nostalgia, on the fantasy of a simpler, purer Rick. In an episode about mass-produced selves, the show pauses to show you a mass-produced advertisement, and it lets a different actor deliver it so that the sales pitch feels like it comes from somewhere outside the machine, even though it does not. And then, underneath all of these parallel tales, one thread pulls tighter than the rest. The Citadel holds a presidential election. Among the candidates is a Morty, and the episode reveals that this Morty wins. He is the character last seen at the very end of that first Citadel episode, the one the audience came to know as Eye Patch Morty, later called Evil Morty. He returns here, years of real-world time later, and he takes power over the entire society of Ricks. Consider the shape of that. A civilization founded by Ricks, a place organized around the supremacy and interchangeability of Rick, is calmly and legally handed to a Morty. The supposedly replaceable one, the sidekick, the accessory, wins the whole game. If you were looking for the episode's answer to its own question, it may be here. The system that treated Mortys as spare parts was defeated by the one part that turned out to be irreplaceable. That victory is not a self-contained ending. The story threads begun in this episode are picked up again much later, in the Season 5 finale, Rickmurai Jack, and again in the Season 7 episode, Unmortricken. So what looks, in the moment, like one clever standalone hour is actually a seed. The series planted its longest and most patient arc inside an episode that most viewers first understood as a detour. A strange week where the main characters wandered off to Atlantis and left us with strangers. The strangers were the point. The detour was the main line. It would take years for the series to fully collect on what it set down here. It is worth stepping back to the ground facts of how this thing came to exist, because they are part of why it is trusted. The episode was written by Dan Guterman and Ryan Ridley, and directed by Dominic Polcino. It premiered on Adult Swim on September 10, 2017, as the 7th episode of the 3rd season and the 28th episode of the series overall. On its original broadcast in the United States, it drew roughly 2.4 million viewers. Those are unremarkable numbers on their face. An ordinary autumn night for a popular cartoon. What followed was less ordinary. The writers, Guterman and Ridley, won the 2018 Annie Award for Outstanding Achievement in Writing for a television or broadcast production, for this episode specifically. An industry that hands out its writing prize to a half hour of animated science fiction is an industry acknowledging that something structurally ambitious happened here, that the parallel stories and the withheld ending and the buried election were not accidents but craft. Return for a moment to that opening choice, now that you know where it leads. Our Rick and Morty meet their Citadel counterparts and then leave for Atlantis, and we stay. Every rule of episodic television says the camera should follow the leads. This episode breaks that rule on purpose, and the break is the thesis. By refusing to follow the Rick and Morty we know, the series tells you that the individuals you have been trained to care about are not, structurally, more important than any of the others. On the Citadel, our protagonists are just two more clones passing through, indistinguishable from the ones who stay behind to live and work and die in the frame. The episode dares you to keep caring anyway, about people you have never seen, and then rewards you for it, because the strangers turn out to carry the most consequential story the series had told to that point. That is the quiet argument the whole hour is built to make. Replaceability is the premise the Citadel is founded on, the comforting industrial idea that one Rick is as good as another, one Morty as disposable as the next. But the episode keeps producing evidence against its own premise. The clones diverge. The single actor gives them separate souls. A young Beth speaks in a voice from outside the pattern. A commercial sells the impossible dream of a purer self. And a Morty, the one everyone assumed was interchangeable, becomes the one figure the whole story cannot do without. By the time the credits run, the Citadel has answered its own question in spite of itself. Sameness was the machine's ideal. Individuality was the fact it could never quite manufacture away. There is a stillness to watching it that suits a late hour. So many stories about clones and duplicates want to frighten you, want to make the loss of the self into horror. This one is calmer than that. It observes. Walking the streets of a rebuilding city, it lets you see ordinary versions of extraordinary people trying to get through the day. It does not shout that identity matters, but simply keeps showing you difference where the world insists there is only repetition, until the accumulation of small differences becomes undeniable, until a single Morty steps out from a crowd of identical faces and takes everything. What defines a Rick, in the end, is not the label shared by millions. It is the one thing about each of them that the copying failed to reproduce. The address C137. For most of the series' run, that string of a letter and 3 numbers is the address the audience learns to call home. The designation is first spoken in the Season 1 finale, an episode titled Close Rick Counters. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it, because it turns a suburban garage into a coordinate, a place on a map so large the map has no edges. The show is telling you, quietly, that the family at its center is one family among an uncountable number of nearly identical families, and that the only reason this one matters is that we happen to be watching it. To understand what that address means, you have to understand the machinery that assigns it. In that same finale, we are shown the Citadel of Ricks, a pocket dimension built and populated entirely by Ricks and by Mortys, gathered from across the many realities. It is governed by something called the Council of Ricks, a body of Ricks who decided, at some point, that infinite versions of the same genius ought to organize rather than compete. The idea is strange enough to sit with for a moment. Think about what it would mean to build a society out of copies of yourself, and then to need a government to keep those copies from murdering one another. That tension is the joke, and it is also the thesis. Ricks are, broadly, the same man. What differs is only the life each one happened to live. The council is more than background scenery. In that same trial, they arrest our Rick, the one filed as C137, for the murder of 27 other Ricks. He is a suspect precisely because he is a known quantity, a Rick who refused to join their organization and became, in their eyes, a malcontent. And it is here that a listener first meets a phrase that will not be explained for years. A council member tells him, in effect, that of all the Ricks in what fans would come to call the central finite curve, he is the malcontent. The central finite curve. The words go by almost casually, a piece of jargon dropped into an argument, and the series does not pause to define them. For most of its history, that phrase simply hangs there, a term with the weight of an explanation, but none of the substance. There is another revelation folded into that same episode, and it reframes the entire premise of the series. Morty learns why a Rick keeps a Morty at all. A Morty's brainwaves are described as complementary to a Rick's, and when the two are near one another, those brainwaves cancel out. They cloak a Rick's genius-level brain signature, hiding it from anything that might be scanning for so bright and so dangerous a mind. So the grandson is not merely a companion or a sidekick, he is camouflage. The most affecting relationship on the series is revealed, in its first season, to have a coldly practical origin, and the show lets you decide how much of the warmth survives that knowledge. The Citadel takes this logic to a place that is almost unbearable to consider. Because a Morty is useful to a Rick, and because there are infinite dimensions, the supply of Mortys is effectively endless, and so they are treated as inventory. The Council can take a Rick whose own Morty was never born, or whose Morty has died, and assign him a replacement Morty sourced from some other dimension where the reverse tragedy occurred, one child pulled sideways across realities to fill a gap in another child's family. On the Citadel, there are Ricks who sell Morty merchandise and Ricks who sell Morty insurance. The grandsons become accessories, interchangeable, a product line. Hold that against the brainwave revelation, and a pattern emerges. To the system, a Morty is a function, not a person, which is exactly the thing our Morty will spend the series refusing to be. You can watch that refusal register on other faces. When Season 3 opens, in the Rick Shank Redemption, Morty introduces himself to a pair of Council Ricks as Morty C-137, and two of them exchange a startled glance. The look carries information the dialogue does not spell out. It implies that these Ricks recognize C-137 as a notorious figure, a terror Rick, the kind of Rick who by all rights should not have a Morty at all. And yet here the boy stands, claiming that exact address. The moment works because the audience already knows the address means something. A child announcing his home dimension should be unremarkable. Instead, it makes hardened copies of the same man flinch. Now return to that unexplained phrase, because the series finally returns to it. In the Season 5 finale, Rickmurai Jack, the central finite curve is at last defined, and the definition recolors everything that came before. It is not the whole multiverse. It is a curated subset of the infinite multiverse, a hand-picked collection of realities, and the single trait every reality inside it shares is this. In each of them, Rick is the smartest being that reality contains. That is the entire selection criterion. Someone walled off a region of infinity and kept only the universes where Rick wins. Every Rick the Council has ever governed, every Rick on the Citadel, every version of the man the series has shown you, lives inside that curve, inside a bubble deliberately shaped so that a Rick is never outmatched. The implications settle slowly. If you gather infinite universes but keep only the ones where a particular person is supreme, you have not discovered a truth about that person. You have built a flattering cage and called it the world. The Ricks believe themselves to be the apex of all possible existence, and they are, but only because everything capable of humbling them was excluded by design. It is the grandest possible version of a small and human vanity, the choice to live only among people you can beat. And in the same finale, someone breaks the wall. At the end of Rickmurai Jack, evil Morty fires a portal through the boundary of the central finite curve and steps through it, out of the curated region, and into the wider, uncurated multiverse that lies beyond. He leaves the bubble entirely. For the first time, the show gestures at what exists outside the flattering cage, an infinity that was never sorted or selected, where a Rick is simply one being among endless others and holds no special rank. A Morty is the one who finds the door. The finale carries one more correction, and it reaches all the way back to that 6th installment of the first season. In Rick Potion #9, Rick's attempt at an antidote fails catastrophically and transforms the entire population of the family's home dimension into monstrous, fused creatures the series calls Cronenbergs. The world is ruined, irreparably, by Rick's own hand. So Rick and Morty flee. They portal into an almost identical parallel dimension, one designated C-131, where by chance the local Rick and the local Morty have just died in a successful version of the same experiment. Our Rick and Morty find their own fresh corpses waiting, bury those doubles in the backyard, and step into the dead version's lives. No one in the new house knows the switch happened. Sit with the quiet enormity of that. From Rick Potion #9 onward, the Beth we watch, the Jerry, the Summer, are not the originals the series introduced. They are the C-131 versions, the family that belonged to the dead Rick and the dead Morty. The originals were left behind in a dimension overrun by Cronenbergs, abandoned. The show changed universes partway through its first season and simply kept going, and most viewers did not notice, because the replacements were identical to a degree that made the difference invisible. It is the multiverse's central idea enacted on the family itself. If every version is nearly the same, then a substitution costs nothing that anyone can see. Nothing, except the truth of who these people are. This is also where a long-running confusion gets untangled. The dimension where the series began, the Cronenberg world abandoned in Rick Potion #9, came to be called by fans the Prime Dimension, an out-of-universe nickname the series never used. For years, many assumed it was C137 because Morty himself had identified it that way. But that identification turns out to be wrong. That first dimension was never the home of our protagonist. Rickmurai Jack reveals it to be the home dimension of a different Rick entirely, the one the show comes to call Rick Prime. Morty had mislabeled the very ground the series stood on, and the mistake went uncorrected for the better part of a decade. The reveal that reorders our Rick's whole character sits in that same finale, and it is the most human fact in a show about infinite men. Rickmurai Jack shows that Rick Prime murdered our Rick's original wife, named Diane, and their daughter, named Beth, with a bomb sent through a portal. He did it after our Rick refused to join him. That single act of grief and rage is what set our Rick on the path that becomes the entire series. The drinking, the nihilism, the flight across dimensions. The smartest man in his corner of infinity was made, not born, by a loss that no amount of genius could undo. The series had shown us a version of this origin before, and it had warned us not to trust it. In The Rick Shank Redemption, Rick's past appears as a brainalized flashback, a memory extracted under duress and flagged, within the episode, as partly fabricated. Rickmurai Jack returns to that flashback and confirms that most of it happened as depicted, with one correction. Rick did not, in the moment after the bombing, immediately invent the portal gun and set out for revenge. He first went by ambulance, to be treated for his injuries. It is a small adjustment, and it is the whole difference between a legend and a man. The mythic version invents a way to conquer reality in the same breath as his grief. The real version is hurt, and has to be carried to a hospital first. All of this bears on a question the series keeps circling. If there are infinite Ricks and ours is merely one, what makes him the one worth following? The creators have offered an answer of sorts. Some fans have pieced together the idea that our own Rick, the one tagged C137, is the true Rickest Rick, the central and most essential version, while also being, in a sense, the second Rickest Rick. The distinction turns on Rick Prime, the Rick many fans consider the one who actually invented interdimensional portal travel first, ahead of all the others. So our Rick is the Rickest in spirit and the second in sequence, the fullest expression of a Rick without being the original from whom the ability spread. It is a fittingly divided answer for a show built on copies. He is the definitive version of a man he did not manage to become first, which brings the whole design back to that boy and his insistence on a single grandfather. He knows now what a Morty is to the system, a cloaking device, a product, a thing that can be swapped in from another dimension when one wears out. He has stood in front of Ricks who flinched at the mere sound of his home address, and he has lived in a family that is not the one he was born into, in a dimension that is not the one he started in, following a man who is one of endless, nearly identical men. And still, against all of that machinery, he holds to the claim that his Rick is his, and no other will do. In a universe curated to prove that everyone is replaceable, that refusal is the only thing the curve was not built to contain. By the 9th episode of Season 3, the series turns its attention to Beth, and in doing so, it hands the audience a question it never intends to answer. The episode is called The ABCs of Beth, and it aired on the 24th of September, 2017. Mike McMahon wrote it. Juan Mesa Leon directed it. On its first broadcast, it drew 2.49 million viewers in the United States and a rating of 1.47 among adults between 18 and 49, according to Nielsen. Those are the plain facts of its arrival. What the episode actually does, underneath the numbers, is far stranger. and it is the reason this chapter exists at all. It takes the family's most stable member and silently asks whether she is even herself. The story begins with a piece of news that reaches back decades. Beth learns that a man named Joseph Lipnip is about to be executed for the murder of his son Tommy, a childhood friend of hers who vanished long ago. Tommy was her friend when she was a girl, and now his father is set to die for a killing everyone assumes happened all those years past. This is the thread that pulls Beth back into her own childhood, and it is the thread that pulls Rick back in with her. Because the disappearance of Tommy is bound up with something Rick made and something Rick has never fully explained. That something is Fruppyland. For most of Beth's life, and for most of the audience's understanding of her, Fruppyland has the shape of a childhood memory, the kind of imaginary place a lonely girl might invent and then half forget. Rick reveals that this is not what it was. Fruppyland was not imagination. It was a real place, an actual pocket dimension that he invented and built for her. A private world with its own ground and its own sky and its own creatures, made so that his daughter would have somewhere to play. Weigh what that means as a gift from a father. Not a treehouse, not a backyard, but an entire dimension, sealed off, populated, and handed to a child. It is generosity and it is abandonment at once, a way of loving her that is also a way of putting her somewhere out of the way. Rick and Beth travel into Fruppyland together to work through the unresolved business of her childhood, and this is where the episode does its quietest and most important work. The two of them go into the world he made for her, and they go looking for the truth about Tommy. What they find is not a corpse, and not a mystery of the ordinary kind. They find that Tommy Lipnip survived. He did not die as a boy. He lived on into adulthood, inside the pocket dimension, and the way he survived is one of the more grotesque inventions the series ever committed to. Tommy stayed alive by mating with the dimension's predatory wildlife, the creatures Rick had built into the place, and the offspring of those unions carried human DNA. Over time, Tommy came to rule over them. He became a king, presiding over a population of half-human things descended from himself, in a world that was supposed to be a playground. Tommy is voiced in these scenes by the guest actor Thomas Middleditch, and the performance gives the grown king a certain hollow dignity, a man who has made a kind of sense of an impossible life. But the horror of what has happened to him is not really the point. The point is what it reveals about the world Rick built and about what it means that Beth spent her girlhood inside it. A father made a dimension where a child could get lost forever, and a child did, and the father never came looking. That is the shape of the guilt the episode is circling, though it never states it so bluntly. To fix the situation in the human world, Beth takes a very deliberate action. She cuts off one of Tommy's fingers. She does this so that Rick can use the DNA in it to grow a clone, a replacement Tommy, a duplicate body that can be produced and delivered back into the ordinary world so that Joseph Lipnip can be exonerated. If there is a Tommy, alive or accountably accounted for, then the father did not murder him, and the execution becomes unjust and can be stopped. So a finger is severed, a body is cloned from it, and a man's life is saved by manufacturing a copy of the son everyone thought was dead. Hold that image for a moment because the episode is about to do the same thing to Beth herself, and it wants you to have already watched her do it to someone else without flinching. Notice how casually the show treats the manufacture of a person here. A clone of Tommy is not presented as a philosophical event. It is a solution, a piece of paperwork made flesh, a way to correct the record. Beth cuts the finger, and Rick grows the man, and the human world gets its tidy ending. The ease of it is the setup. The series has now established, inside its own logic, that a living copy of a person can be produced from a scrap of tissue, and that such a copy is good enough to stand in for the original in the eyes of the world. Everything that follows for Beth rests on that established fact. And so the episode arrives at its real subject, which is not Tommy at all but Beth, and the question of who she is. By the end, Rick offers his daughter a choice. He tells her, in effect, that she can leave. She can leave her family and travel the universe freely, going wherever she wants, unburdened by the life she has built. while a cloned Beth is made to stay behind and take her place. A copy of her would remain in the house, would be a mother to Morty and Summer, would be a wife to the life she left, and the real Beth would be gone into the stars. Or she can stay. She can remain with her family exactly as she is, with no clone standing in for her. The woman she has always been, continuing to be that woman. 2 doors, and only she can walk through one of them. The series never tells you which door she chose. This is the crucial thing, and it is deliberate. The episode ends without revealing, on screen, whether the Beth who remains with the family is the original Beth who decided to stay, or a clone left behind while the real one flew off into the universe. Beth herself, in later scenes, seems the same. The family is intact. Dinner happens. Life goes on. But the audience has been shown the offer and denied the answer, and there is no way, from anything the episode presents, to know which Beth is sitting at the table. She could be herself. She could be a manufactured copy of herself who believes she is herself. The 2 possibilities are, from the outside, identical. Consider what a strange and patient piece of storytelling this is. The series takes its most grounded character, the daughter, the mother, the one who anchors the family's emotional reality, and it discreetly removes the certainty of her identity, and then it simply continues as if nothing has changed. There is no dramatic reveal, no clone with a scar or a tell. The doubt is planted and then left to sit. Entertainment writers at Inverse would later call the unresolved question of whether Beth or a clone stayed with the family the biggest Rick and Morty mystery going into Season 4, precisely because it set up a lasting doubt over who Beth really is. A single scene, no answer given, and it becomes the thread that a whole following season would carry. This is where the chapter's deeper mirror comes into focus, because Beth's predicament is Rick's predicament, turned toward a different member of the family. The series has spent seasons making the audience uncertain about which Rick this Rick is, whether he is the original, whether he even values the distinction. Now it does the same to Beth. The father who cannot be pinned down as a single stable self has a daughter who now cannot be pinned down either, and he is the one who offered her the machinery to make it so. The clone technology that renders Beth's identity uncertain is Rick's technology, built by Rick, offered by Rick. In making his daughter's selfhood a question, he has reproduced his own condition in her. The ambiguity runs in the family, and it runs from him outward. There is a line from the series co-creator Dan Harmon that helps explain the temperature of all this. The reason the episode can commit such an act against its own characters without ever quite condemning it. Harmon described Rick's worldview in terms relevant to this very episode. Evil, by this reading, is a construct that Rick does not really believe in. The universe, in Rick's view, is populated with stupidity, and Rick is the smartest person in it. From inside that worldview, offering to clone your daughter so she can be free is not cruelty and not kindness. It is simply the cleanest solution to the problem of a person who feels trapped. There is no evil in it because Rick does not think in those terms. There is only intelligence applied to circumstance, and the circumstance happens to be his own child's sense of self. That is why the episode feels so cold at its center, even as it presents itself as a gift from a father to a daughter. Around this quiet devastation, the episode keeps a lighter thread running, and it is worth following because it rhymes with the main story in its own smaller key. Jerry, separated from the family's central drama, has taken up with a new girlfriend, an alien huntress named Kiara, whose name is also spelled Kiera, voiced by the guest actor Jennifer Hale. Morty and Summer spend the episode wary of her, uneasy about their father's new companion, in the way children are uneasy when a parent moves on too quickly. The relationship does not last. It ends when both Jerry and Kiara admit the truth of what they were doing, that each of them was using the other as a way to get over a past relationship rather than out of any real feeling. It is a small, honest little collapse, two lonely people recognizing that they were never really together, only using one another as cover. Set that beside Beth's story and a pattern appears. The whole family, in this episode, is negotiating what is real and what is a substitute. Jerry finds a partner who turns out to be a stand-in for someone he has lost, and he lets her go once he admits it. Beth is offered the chance to become a stand-in for herself, or to send a stand-in into her own life, and she is never made to admit anything, because the episode refuses to tell us what she decided. The two subplots ask the same question from opposite ends. What is the difference between the real thing and the copy that serves in its place? And does it matter if no one can tell them apart? Jerry's answer is that it matters, and he walks away. Beth's answer is withheld. The doubt this episode plants does not stay buried. It is picked up directly at the very end of the following season, when the series introduces the figure who comes to be called Space Beth in the Season 4 finale, an episode titled Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry. That later episode reignites exactly the question this one left open, the question of which Beth is the original and which is the clone, by putting two Beths on the screen at once, the one who stayed and the one who left, each with an equal claim to being the true daughter. What was a single unanswered offer in the ABCs of Beth becomes a season later a living confrontation. The clone that may or may not have been made walks back into the story, and the family is forced to look at a version of the same person and decide, or fail to decide, who is who. But that reckoning belongs to a later chapter. For now, at the close of the ABCs of Beth, the situation rests in its unresolved quiet. A father built a world for his daughter and then offered to duplicate her. A finger was cut, a man was cloned, an execution was stopped, and a life went on that may or may not be the life it appears to be. The woman at the table is either Beth or a perfect copy of Beth, and the show, having shown you the machinery that could produce either, simply lets the dinner continue and moves on, leaving the doubt to grow in the dark where it was planted. There is a moment in the second season when this series stops pretending to be about aliens and starts, without warning, being about something much closer to home. The episode is called Total Recall. It was written by Mike McMahon and directed by Juan Meza Leon, and it first aired in the middle of August 2015. On its surface, it is a bottle episode, a story that traps its characters in a single house and refuses to let them leave. But underneath that surface, it is asking a question that this entire series will return to again and again, and it asks it more directly here than almost anywhere else. How do you know that the person sitting across from you is really who they claim to be? The premise is deceptively simple. Memory parasites invade the Smith household. These creatures do not attack, and they do not threaten. Instead, they multiply by a gentler and far more insidious method. They implant false memories into the minds of the family, pleasant memories, warm memories, and each implanted memory gives the parasite a foothold. The more the family remembers a creature fondly, the more real that creature becomes to them. Notice what that means as a mechanism of survival. These parasites do not need to overpower you. They only need you to love them, and love, in this house, is manufactured out of borrowed nostalgia, a supply that seems to have no limit. Rick is the first to understand what is happening. Early in the episode, he shoots a character named Steve, and in doing so, he exposes Steve as a parasite rather than a person. Rick explains, in effect, that the species multiplies by planting false memories in people's heads, and that every friendly face crowding the house is a symptom of an infection rather than a member of the family. It is a violent and abrupt way to make a point, but it is also the only kind of proof that works here. You cannot reason a parasite out of existence when the parasite has already rewritten your memory of it. You can only test it against something harder than feeling. So Rick reaches for a method that is almost bureaucratic in its coldness. He declares that there should be only 6 real members of this household: himself, Morty, Summer, Beth, Jerry, and Mr. Poopy Butthole. He writes these 6 names on a sign, and the sign becomes the household's single point of reference, a fixed list to check every face against. There is something quietly moving about this gesture, though the series would never call attention to it. When memory itself has been compromised, when the mind can no longer be trusted to distinguish the real from the implanted, the family falls back on a written record. They externalize their certainty. They put the truth on a wall because they can no longer keep it safely inside their own heads. The sign is tested almost immediately, and the test reveals how fragile the whole system is. Mr. Poopy Butthole recalls a memory of a figure he calls Cousin Nicky, and in the strange logic of this episode, the act of remembering Nicky causes Nicky to physically appear in the room, summoned into being by the recollection itself. Rick checks this new arrival against the 6 names on the sign, finds that he does not belong there, and shoots him. Cousin Nicky, for the record, was voiced by a credited guest performer on the episode's cast list, which is a small production detail worth holding on to, precisely because the character exists for such a short and doomed span of screen time. But Nicky matters for a reason larger than his brief appearance, and it is Morty who works out why. The false memories the parasites implant all share a single quality. They are pleasant, they are happy. Every borrowed recollection is a fond one, a warm scene of togetherness, and this is not a coincidence, but a limitation of the creatures themselves. The parasites can only make you remember loving them. They cannot make you remember being hurt by them, being disappointed by them, being trapped in a small space with them, and wishing you were anywhere else. Morty notices this, and in noticing it, he finds the flaw in the entire invasion. Any character whom no member of the family can recall unpleasantly must be an imposter. Bad memories become the test for what is real. And here the episode plants a single telling exception, which rewards a careful listener. Among all the golden false memories that flood the house, there is exactly one that is not pleasant. It is a memory involving Cousin Nicky, in which the family and Mr. Poopy Butthole get trapped in an elevator together after going to see a Hulk stage musical. It is a small, irritating, mundane misery, the kind of memory that families actually accumulate. That one sour recollection stands out against all the sweetness surrounding it, and it hints at a distinction the episode will not fully resolve until much later. Not every memory in this house obeys the same rules. Something here is capable of unpleasantness, and unpleasantness in this story is the signature of the real. Morty turns his own theory into a weapon, and he does it in the most personal way available to him. To prove that Rick is a genuine family member and not a parasite, Morty offers up his own memories of Rick. Not the good ones, the bad ones, and he has, by his own account, a great many of them. The disappointments, the humiliations, the times Rick has frightened or failed him, all of that accumulated grievance, which in any ordinary story would be evidence of a damaged relationship, becomes here the proof of authenticity. A parasite could never have given Morty those memories. Only the real Rick could have earned them. Consider the strange tenderness buried in that logic. The measure of a real bond is not how much joy it has produced, but how much pain it has survived. The people who are truly yours are the ones you have genuine reasons to resent. From here, the test turns lethal, and it turns on the people the family loves most. Beth kills a parasite named Sleepy Gary, a creature the family had come to believe was her husband. Negative memory testing exposes him as fake, and once exposed, he is dispatched. But the consequences of that killing land on Jerry, and they land hard. The parasitic takeover had erased Jerry's own memory of his marriage to Beth, hollowing out the very history that defined him. With Sleepy Gary gone, and his own past thrown into question, Jerry, by some accounts of the episode, spirals toward despair. He is said to ask Beth to end his life, unable to be certain that he himself is not a parasite. Sit with the horror of that for a moment. The infection fills the house with false people, and then it goes further, making the real people doubt their own reality. Jerry cannot find the evidence of his own genuineness, and without it, he would rather be destroyed than risk being one of the things they have been killing all night. Then comes the moment the whole episode has been building toward, and it is the cruelest application of the rule the family has come to trust. Beth turns the test on Mr. Poopy Butthole, one of the original 6 names on the sign. She cannot recall a single bad memory of him, neither can anyone else. By the logic they have all agreed upon, that absence of unpleasantness marks him as a parasite, and so Beth shoots him. But he does not dissolve into an alien thing. He bleeds. Real blood, the blood of a genuine member of the family, spills out of him, and in that instant the family's method is revealed to have a terrible blind spot. The absence of a bad memory did not prove he was fake. It only proved that he had never given them a reason to hold one. The test that saved them from the parasites also led them to shoot one of their own. The series does not let this pass as a joke and walk away, which is part of why the episode endures. A scene after the credits shows Mr. Poopy Butthole alive and undergoing physical therapy for the gunshot wound Beth inflicted. The consequence is real. The injury is real. He survives, but he carries the mark of the family's mistake, a wound earned simply by being the one member no one had ever quarreled with. There is a final layer to all of this, and it lives outside the episode itself, in the space where a show's creators talk about their own work. Dan Harmon, the series co-creator, has floated an idea in entertainment press coverage that reframes everything you have just watched. The suggestion is that Mr. Poopy Butthole may himself be a rarer kind of memory parasite, one capable of implanting both good and bad memories, unlike the ordinary parasites the family manages to kill. If that were true, it would explain the single unpleasant elevator memory, and it would explain why the family could never quite catch him. It would mean that the one creature they could not detect was the subtlest of them all, a parasite so complete that it could counterfeit the very unpleasantness the family used as proof. It is important to be careful here, because this is a theory that Harmon has discussed, and not a fact the episode ever confirms on screen. Nothing in Total Recall verifies it. The blood the family sees is real blood, and the character survives as one of them. But the theory lingers, the way the best uncertainties do, right at the edge of sleep. It takes the episode's central question and refuses to close it. The family built a machine for detecting who was real, and the machine worked, mostly, and it still may have missed the one thing it was built to find. And if the test that measures reality by counting old wounds can be fooled by a creature clever enough to give you wounds, then the question this whole series keeps asking has no clean answer. You cannot finally prove that the person across from you is who they say they are. You can only decide, night after night, to keep the sign on the wall and to trust the 6 names written there. There is a machine at the center of this chapter, and the machine makes a promise. In the 6th outing of the 3rd season, an episode called Rest and Ricklaxation, written by Tom Kaufman and directed by Anthony Chun, Rick and Morty go to an alien spa to recover from an adventure that has left them frayed. The spa offers a detox pod, a device meant to remove psychological toxicity from a person, to draw off the poison and leave the healthier self behind. That is the pitch, a cleansing, a restoration of who you were before the damage. And for a show that spends most of its time insisting Rick is a fixed and singular quantity, a genius too large and too consistent to be anything but himself, what happens next is a quiet act of demolition. The machine does not remove anything. It divides. Instead of drawing the toxicity out and discarding it, the pod splits each of them into 2 physically distinct people, a clean version and a toxic version, so that where 2 figures walked in, 4 walk out. 2 Ricks, 2 Mortys, and each half is a real body, a real mind, a real person with its own opinions and appetites. Consider what that means for a moment. The device does not treat toxicity as a stain to be scrubbed away. It treats it as a component, a removable part, and the moment you can remove a part and have it stand up and walk around on its own, you have admitted that the original was assembled from parts in the first place. Rick, the show's supposed constant, turns out to be separable. He comes apart cleanly, along a seam that was apparently always there. Look at what ends up on each side of that seam. Toxic Rick carries the rudeness, the lying, the alcoholism, the God complex, the whole genius asshole architecture that the series has spent seasons presenting as simply who Rick is. All of it lifts out of him and becomes a person. Toxic Morty, correspondingly, holds the nervousness, the desperation, the self-loathing, the churning anxiety that has defined Morty since the beginning. These are not add-ons. These are the traits we have understood as the core of both characters, the very things that make Rick recognizably Rick and Morty recognizably Morty. And here they are, purged, walking off in a different direction as a separate pair. The episode is telling you, without saying it out loud, that everything you thought was essential about these two men was in fact detachable, and that what remains when you detach it is something else entirely. Because what remains is strange. Clean Rick keeps the intelligence, all of it, the raw processing power that lets him bend reality, but he becomes polite and thoughtful, courteous, where the original was cruel. The genius survives the split intact. It is only the poison that leaves. So the intelligence, it turns out, was never the toxic part, and the toxicity was never the source of the intelligence. Two things the series often lets us assume are bound together: that Rick is brilliant because he is broken, that the cruelty is the price of the genius. The detox pod separates them and proves they were never the same thing. Clean Rick is proof that you can have the mind without the venom. That should unsettle you, if you have spent 3 seasons accepting the venom as the cost of admission. Clean Morty is the more disturbing result, and the episode seems to know it. Freed from his anxiety, from the self-doubt and the desperate need for approval, he does not become happy in any recognizable way. He becomes confident, charming, and completely detached, emotionally hollowed out, so absent of feeling that recappers described him, accurately, as a textbook sociopath. Think about what that implies. Morty's anxiety, the trait we most want to relieve him of, the burden we watch him carry episode after episode and wish we could lift, turns out to be the very thing that was holding his conscience in place. Remove the suffering, and you do not get a well-adjusted boy. You get a smooth and pleasant void. The self-loathing, it seems, was load-bearing. It was doing the work of making him a person who cares. Watch what Clean Morty does with his new freedom, because it is chillingly efficient. He crushes Rick's phone, deliberately, to cut off all contact with the toxic versions of himself and his grandfather, severing the connection to the part of him that still feels. Then he sets about improving the world around him in his own frictionless way, pushing people toward a carefree bliss, boosting the self-esteem of the other students at school. On the surface, this looks like kindness, a charming boy going around making people feel better about themselves. But there is nothing behind it, no warmth driving the gestures, only a kind of programmatic pleasantness, the actions of someone who has learned what care looks like and can perform it flawlessly without feeling any of it. He is not helping people because he loves them. He is helping people because it is smooth, and smoothness is now all he is. Meanwhile, the toxic halves are having their own crisis, and it escalates the way these things escalate on this show, outward and upward. Toxic Rick, carrying the full weight of Rick's god complex and rage, tries to force Clean Rick into the toxic wasteland, to banish the polite version into the poison dimension and reclaim the position of the one true Rick. When that fails, when he cannot exile his cleaner self, he does not accept defeat, and he does not shrink. He does the maximal thing. He resolves to spread toxicity across the entire world, to make everyone as poisoned as he is, turning a private conflict between two halves of one man into a planetary emergency. It is worth pausing on the logic of that. Rejected as a fragment, the toxic half decides to remake reality in its own image rather than be contained. The part that got purged refuses to stay purged. It metastasizes. The resolution of the Rick side of the split is where the episode makes its clearest statement about how the show understands him. Clean Rick, the polite one, the one with all the intelligence and none of the cruelty, does something that requires cruelty. He shoots toxic Morty with a nanobotic poison, a lethal thing, a genuine threat to the boy's life. And this is the lever, because toxic Rick, for all his rage and his god complex, cannot let toxic Morty die. To save him, toxic Rick has to remerge with Clean Rick, to fuse the two halves back into one, because only the reunified whole has what it takes to undo the poison. So the two Ricks collapse back into a single Rick, and the series restores what it calls the true Rick, the complete one, toxicity and genius and politeness and cruelty, all folded back together into the man we started with. Pay attention to what that reunion says. The series could have let Clean Rick win, could have let the polite, brilliant, non-toxic version be the real one, the improved model, and sent the poison off into the wasteland for good. It does not. What it insists instead is that the true Rick is the merged Rick, that neither half alone is the genuine article, that the actual person is the sum and not either part, which is a remarkable admission for a show built around a supposedly singular protagonist. Rick's authenticity, the episode says, lives in the recombination. He is real only when both halves are present. Split him, and you do not get two lesser Ricks and one true one. You get two incomplete people, and the truth of him is the seam healing over, the parts snapping back together into a whole that was never as indivisible as it pretended to be. And then, having shown you a clean reunion for Rick, the episode refuses to give you the same for Morty, and this is the quiet devastation at its core. Clean Morty will not remerge. Offered the chance to take his anxiety back, to become whole again in the way Rick did, he declines. He wants nothing to do with his suffering half, so the split stays split. 3 weeks pass, and Clean Morty has thrived on his own. He has relocated to New York City. He has become a stockbroker, ruthless and successful, unburdened by guilt, a young man moving through the world of high finance with no conscience to slow him down. The absence of anxiety that made him hollow at school makes him formidable in a trading floor. What was monstrous in a boy is, apparently, an asset in a broker. The show frames this stretch as parody, and the parody is exact. Clean Morty's stockbroker life is a direct send-up of The Wolf of Wall Street, complete with Jordan Belfort-style stock-selling methods, the high-pressure hustle, the amorality dressed as ambition. When the reunified Rick finally sees what his clean grandson has become, he describes him, in effect, as a tiny American psycho, invoking that other portrait of a polished and empty man who moves through wealth and violence without a flicker of feeling. Both references point at the same thing: a person who looks like success and functions like a machine, who has all the surface of a human being and none of the interior. The joke is doing analytical work. It is telling you exactly what Morty became when you took his pain away, and it is telling you that our culture has a name for that person and sometimes rewards him lavishly. Rick does not accept the split ending for Morty the way he accepted it for himself, and he does not ask permission. He tracks Clean Morty down in New York, finds the ruthless stockbroker in the middle of his guilt-free life, and forcibly re-injects him with toxic Morty, driving the anxious, self-doubting half back into the confident one whether he wants it or not. The merge that Rick underwent by choice, to save a life, Morty undergoes by force, at his grandfather's hands. And the result restores Morty's original personality, the nervousness and the self-doubt and the churning worry, all flooding back into him, making him once again the boy we recognize. Rick decides on Morty's behalf that the whole anxious Morty is the real one, that the smooth and successful sociopath has to be dismantled and the suffering reassembled, that a Morty who feels bad is truer than a Morty who feels nothing. There is a strange gentleness in how the episode closes the loop on him. Morty returns to school with his usual self-doubt intact, restored to his ordinary discomfort, and Jessica tells him, in effect, that it is good to have him back. Good to have him back. As though the anxious, uncertain Morty is the one worth having, the one people missed, the one whose return is a small relief. The confident version boosted everyone's self-esteem and felt nothing. The restored version is a nervous boy who cannot quite meet Jessica's eyes, and that is the one she is glad to see. The series lands, softly, on the idea that the suffering is part of what makes him lovable, that you cannot subtract the pain without subtracting the person people actually care about. There is one more thread, and it runs alongside the main split like a small, absurd echo of the same idea. Summer's friend Stacy helps free Morty and Rick during the crisis, and in the process she ends up swapping places with the toxic versions, trapped inside the machine, caught in the toxic dimension herself while the others escape. Before all of this, Morty and Stacy had agreed on a safe word, sea cucumber, a signal to use when someone wants out of the situation, and Morty invokes it when he needs release. The safe word pays off in the post-credits scene, when Stacy is teleported back to the real world, escaping the toxic dimension, shouting sea cucumber as she returns. It is a joke, and a small one, but it rhymes with everything else here. A person pulled out of the toxic place, and return to herself. A signal that means, let me out of this, an escape from a machine that traps and divides. Around all of this sit the plain facts of the thing as a piece of television. Rest and Ricklaxation aired on Adult Swim on the 27th of August, 2017, and drew roughly 2.5 million American viewers on its first broadcast. As of verification, it holds an 8.8 out of 10 on IMDb, from more than 17,000 ratings, which places it among the episodes audiences return to and think about. And what they are returning to, underneath the spa and the stockbroker and the safe word, is a machine that promised to make Rick and Morty cleaner, and instead proved they could be taken apart. 2 Ricks, 2 Mortys, a seam where there was supposed to be a solid person. The series can put them back together, and it does, but it can never quite unshow you that they came apart in the first place, that the self it treats as singular was, all along, divisible. There is a moment near the middle of Rick and Morty's 4th season when the show stops pretending it is anything other than a machine built out of choices, and instead turns to face you directly. The episode is called Never Ricking Morty. It is the 6th of the season, written by Jeff Loveness and directed by Erica Hayes, and it first aired on the 3rd of May, 2020, on Adult Swim. If you have been following this long meditation on the question of who the real Rick is, of whether there even is such a thing, then this is the chapter where the series answers the question itself, out loud, and the answer is stranger and more honest than any theory a viewer might build. Rick and Morty find themselves trapped aboard a literal story train. It is not a metaphor the narrator is reaching for. It is an anthology device, a train on which various passengers tell competing stories about Rick, one car after another, each one offering a different version of who he is and what he has done. Think about what a device like that means for a show that has spent years teasing its own mythology. A train made of stories about Rick, where every car holds a different Rick, and none of them is required to be true. The premise is the thesis. The setting is the argument. The antagonist of the episode is a figure called Storylord, and his goal is precise in a way that makes the whole thing legible. He captures Rick and Morty because he wants to harvest what the episode calls their story potential. He wants to use that potential as fuel, to power the train forward, past something the episode names the 5th wall. There is a 4th wall, the one that separates fiction from the audience, and Storylord wants to break through the one beyond even that. He is, in other words, a creature made entirely of narrative hunger, a villain whose only desire is more story, more momentum, more forward motion through the machinery of plot. He is the appetite for Canon given a face. And here is the line that sits at the center of everything, the exchange that tells you what the writers actually believe. During the confrontation, Morty asks whether any of this is canon. Rick answers, in effect, that it could have been. Dwell on that for a moment. Not that it is canon, not that it is not, but that it could have been. The stories on the train are not fixed history, and they are not lies either. They are discarded possibilities. They are the plots that were considered and set aside, the versions of Rick that the writers might have committed to and chose not to. The train is a museum of roads not taken, and Rick is walking through it, looking at all the men he could have been made into, none of them more real than the others. One of those cars is worth pausing on, because it parodies exactly the kind of storytelling that fans of long serialized shows tend to crave. In that segment, the train depicts an army of robotic Ricks, led by evil Morty, alongside a corrupted version of Mr. Poopy Butthole. It is the epic villain arc rendered as spectacle, the sort of sprawling, high-stakes serialized confrontation that message boards write theories about for years. And the series presents it here as just another train car, one story among many, a passenger's tale you can watch and then leave behind as the train moves on. The grand mythology is put on the same shelf as everything else, offered and withdrawn in the same gesture. We will come back to why that particular choice matters, because the series would not honor it. The way Rick defeats Storylord is the purest expression of the episode's whole idea, and it is worth describing slowly, because it is a victory achieved by refusing to fight. Storylord runs on story momentum, on the forward pull of narrative, on tension and escalation, and the promise that something is about to happen. So Rick does the one thing that drains all of that away. He and Morty give their lives to Jesus Christ. They simply stop. They surrender the plot, they choose the least dramatic possible turn, and the anticlimax itself becomes the weapon. The train, starved of the momentum it feeds on, grinds to a halt. There is no punch that lands the killing blow, no clever gadget, no reversal. There is only the deliberate deflation of the story, a character reaching into the engine of drama and switching it off. Rick wins by being boring on purpose. He wins by giving the audience the ending they least wanted, which is no ending at all. And then, because the episode is committed to following its own logic all the way down, Jesus Christ appears as a literal deus ex machina, the oldest cheat in the writer's toolbox, the God who descends from the machinery to resolve a plot that cannot resolve itself, arrives here in the flesh, named as exactly what he is. Rick and Morty use him to strand Storylord in a place the episode calls every writer's hell, which is the Bible. The villain who wanted nothing but more story is banished into the most canonical text imaginable, a book of fixed and unalterable narrative, a story that can never be revised. There is a cruel wit in that. The creature of endless plot potential is sentenced to the one story that is finished, sealed, and beyond editing. He wanted canon. He is given the ultimate canon, and it is a prison. Now the episode performs the move that recontextualizes everything you have just watched. The final twist reveals that the entire story train adventure was a toy, a model train, a little painted engine running on a loop of track, acted out by sentient puppet versions of Rick and Morty running in endless circles inside the Smiths' living room. Everything grand, the fifth wall, the harvesting of story potential, the descent of Jesus, all of it was play, staged by small puppets on a child's plaything. The Rick and Morty fan wiki even catalogs these figures separately, listing them as Story Train Rick and Story Train Morty, keeping them distinct from the main Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith of the show. There are, formally, 2 more Ricks now, added to the endless ledger. A puppet Rick, who exists to tell stories about Rick, spinning in a circle on a table, and a fandom careful enough to give him his own entry. The reveal does something sly and pointed to the mythology it has been mocking. The toy train, we learn, was bought by the real Morty for Rick, at the gift shop of the Citadel of Ricks. Rick mocks Morty for buying it. He says, in effect, that Morty looked straight into the bleeding jaws of capitalism and said yes, please. So the entire epic, the whole self-serious apparatus of story and canon and stakes, resolves into a piece of merchandise from a gift shop, an object Rick himself holds in contempt as a symptom of the machinery that sells fans their own obsessions back to them. The grand narrative is a novelty item. The mythology is something you buy at the register on your way out. There is a post-credits scene that grounds all of this even further, and that grounds it, remarkably, in the world outside the series. Puppet Jesus's magic blood short-circuits the toy train, breaking it, and the real Rick, annoyed, tells Morty to go buy a new one, and then he adds a line that reaches straight out of the fiction and into the year it was made. He says nobody is out there shopping with this virus. The episode aired in May of 2020, at the height of the early pandemic lockdowns, and that line plays like an ad-lib slipped into the moment, a small acknowledgement that the world outside the living room had shut its doors. For an episode obsessed with walls between fiction and reality, it is a fitting final gesture. The fifth wall broken not by a villain's engine, but by a real disease keeping real people home. The series cannot power through to some higher plane of story. It can only note, dryly, that the shops are closed. The episode gives you, near its middle, the sentence that functions as its instruction to the audience. Rick tells Morty that if he does not want to be meta, he should stop deconstructing things. It is aimed past Morty, at the viewers who obsess over canon and continuity, who assemble timelines and argue about which Rick is the true one, who treat an animated comedy as a puzzle with a hidden solution. The line does not tell them to stop, exactly. It tells them that the obsession is a choice, and that the meta quality they complain about, or celebrate, is something they summon by looking so hard. If you go digging for the machinery, you will find the machinery, and then you cannot unsee it. The show is meta because you insisted on reading it that way, and it is willing to hand that insistence right back to you. For the viewers who did go digging, the episode buried a genuine reward, and it is the kind of detail that rewards exactly the behavior Rick was needling. Eagle-eyed fans have pointed to what looks like a hidden code on the train's engine control panel. Read correctly, that code maps the episode's own train car scenes onto the beats of Dan Harmon's story circle, the writing framework Harmon uses to structure narrative, the sequence of a character leaving a zone of comfort, wanting something, entering an unfamiliar situation, adapting, getting what they wanted, paying a price, and returning changed. The episode about the machinery of story hides, on the dashboard of its own engine, a schematic of the machinery used to build it. It is a diagram of the loom, stitched into the fabric, and it is placed exactly where only the obsessive would find it, which means the series anticipated the deconstruction and left a private joke for the people who could not help themselves. Even the promotional gag extends the pattern into the real world. The episode's post-credits material references a website, a place called story-train.com, and if a curious viewer went looking for it, the site did not function as a store at all. It simply redirected to Adult Swim's official page. The tease of something to buy, of some further piece of the world to own, dissolves into a corporate homepage. The bleeding jaws of capitalism again, closing on nothing. All of this rests on a view of Canon that Dan Harmon, the series' co-creator, has stated plainly. Speaking generally about series continuity, Harmon has suggested that Canon can drag a show down even as it remains the very thing viewers love, and that when it can be handled without ruining the show, it becomes a great thing. That is the tension the whole episode is built inside. Canon is a weight, and Canon is a gift. And the trick is to carry it lightly, to serve the audience's hunger for continuity, without letting that hunger become the master. Never Rick and Morty is the series taking its own creator's ambivalence and making an entire episode out of it, an episode that mocks the very thing its audience wants, while admitting that the wanting is real and even worthy. And here is where the story turns back on itself in a way that is almost too neat to be accidental. A retrospective some fans point to looked back at this episode and argued that it explicitly mocked the reliance on serialized canon, the epic villain arc, the long game mythology, and then it noted that the series contradicted that very stance only one season later. The army of robotic Ricks, led by Evil Morty, the exact image the train paraded as an example of the storytelling the episode was satirizing, became, a season afterward, a genuine multi-season storyline. Evil Morty and Rick Prime turned into the real spine of the series, the sustained mythology the show had just finished treating as a joke on a toy train. So consider what that means for the question this whole video has been circling. Never Rick and Morty is the series insisting that no single real Rick exists, that no fixed backstory is meant to hold, that the stories about Rick are discarded possibilities rather than settled truth, and that anyone who demands otherwise is choosing to see the machinery. It is the clearest, most deliberate statement of the anti-canon position the series ever made. And then the series went ahead and built a canon anyway. It laughed at the story train and then climbed aboard. Which may be the most honest thing of all, because it means the series does not actually believe there is one right way to hold its own mythology. It rejects the fixed canon, and it builds one, and both of those are true, and neither cancels the other. There is no real Rick, because the show refuses to let there be one, and then it changes its mind, because the wanting was real. You were told, in the middle of the episode, that the meta quality is something you bring to it. Perhaps the same is true of the search for the real Rick. The series keeps the door open in both directions on purpose, so that you can walk through whichever one lets you keep watching. By now, the shape of the deception should feel familiar, but this chapter is the one where every scattered piece is laid side by side, slowly, so that the full picture can settle. To understand who the family on screen actually is, you have to return to Season 1, to an episode called Rick Potion #9, the 6th of that first run. It begins as almost nothing. Morty wants a girl in his class named Jessica to notice him, and Rick, as a favor or a shrug, mixes a love potion for him to use on her. The potion is not stable. It mutates, it spreads, and what starts as one boy's small want becomes a plague that moves through nearly all of humanity in their home dimension, turning person after person into the twisted, fleshy monsters the show simply calls Cronenbergs. That is the machinery of it. A crush, a chemical, and then a world of monsters. What Rick does next is the hinge on which the entire series turns, and it is worth moving through it carefully, because the series delivers it quietly and then never explains it again. Faced with a ruined planet, Rick does not try to reverse the mutation. He does not labor to cure the people he helped deform. Instead, he scans the multiverse, searching not for a solution, but for an exit. He finds a parallel dimension, one almost identical to his own, where a local Rick and a local Morty had just managed to fix this very same problem, had just saved their version of the world, and had then died in the aftermath. Two bodies, freshly dead, in a version of the house he knows. Rick sees an opening. He leads Morty across into that dimension to take their places. Think about what that requires of a person. In that other dimension's backyard, Rick and Morty bury the dead alternate counterparts, the Rick and Morty who actually earned that saved world, and then they enter the house and silently assume their identities. No announcement is made, no confession is offered. They simply live on as replacements inside that other Beth, that other Jerry, that other Summers family, wearing the faces of the dead men in the yard. The grave is a few steps from the kitchen door, and no one but Rick and Morty knows it is there. Here is the consequence that reframes everything that follows, and it is the reason this chapter exists. From that moment forward, the Beth, the Jerry, and the Summer the series follows are not biologically related to the Rick and Morty we watch on screen. Their real father and grandfather, their real son and brother, are the ones under the dirt. The family we spend season after season with is grieving no one because they do not know anyone is gone. The two people who could tell them are the two people who took the missing men's place. Every dinner, every argument, every tender moment after that episode happens, across a gap that only half the room can see. The series does not give these dimensions tidy on-screen names for all of this, so it helps to borrow the vocabulary that grew up around the series. The abandoned original dimension, the one Rick and Morty walked away from and left to rot, is cataloged on the series wiki as the prime dimension. And the mutation event itself, the moment the potion turned the world into monsters, is given a name inside the show by the surviving Jerry there, who calls it the Great Cronening. It is a small, grim joke, the kind the series is fond of, but sitting underneath the joke is a genuine horror. A world ended, and the people who ended it left before the credits. Because that is the part easy to forget when you follow the replacements into their comfortable new life. The original family did not vanish. Beth Prime, Jerry Prime, and Summer Prime survived the Great Cronening. They lived on in the ravaged Prime dimension, in the world their own Rick and Morty had abandoned, and they survived it the only way that world allowed. They hunted the Cronenbergs. They ate them. The monsters that had once been their neighbors became the thing that kept them alive, and they endured that way in a place the series only occasionally returns to, a place most viewers never think about, because the story moved to a cleaner dimension and never looked back. Their ends come slowly, across different episodes, and the show does not gather them into one moment, so you have to gather them yourself. Summer Prime turns up again in The Rick Shank Rickdemption, the first episode of Season 3, and what we see of her is a corpse frozen to death, her body held by the Citadel of Ricks. Whatever happened to her happened in the cold, far from home, in the custody of an institution built entirely out of versions of the man who left her behind. Beth Prime dies later, and the cause is almost unbearably fitting. She dies from an infection caused by the same Cronenberg mutation that ended her world. The plague that Rick and Morty fled took her in the end, just slowly, through a wound that would not heal. That leaves Jerry Prime, the last of them, the last living person from the entire Prime dimension. His death arrives in Solarix, the Season 6 premiere, which landed in September of 2022. He is shot and killed, and the person who kills him is a Rick, though not the one we have been following. He is killed by Rick Prime. With that single shot, the Prime family line ends completely. The father, the mother, the daughter, all gone, and the sons and the Rick who belonged to them already dead and buried in another dimension's backyard, years earlier and worlds away. An entire family wiped from existence, and the family that took their name lives on none the wiser. To follow the rest of this recap, you need to be clear about who our Rick actually is, because the series does eventually give him a designation. In that Season 1 trial, the 10th episode of the first run, the Interdimensional Council of Ricks, the bureaucratic body made of countless versions of the same man, formally identifies the Rick we follow as Rick C-137. That is his label. Not a name so much as a coordinate, a way of picking one Rick out of an infinity of Ricks. And it matters here because the man who kills Jerry Prime, Rick Prime, is a different Rick entirely, and the tangle between the two of them is the second great secret this chapter has to lay out. For a long time, the series fed us an origin for Rick C-137, and it fed it to us in a way designed to be doubted. Again, it is the Rick Shank Rickdemption, Season 3, that holds the key scene. A Galactic Federation agent is inside Rick's mind, and Rick shows him a memory. In it, we see Rick's wife, Diane, and his daughter Beth, killed by a bomb sent through a portal directly into his garage. The memory is offered as the origin of everything, the reason Rick built his portal gun, the reason he wages his long war against the Federation. It is a clean, terrible story, and it explains the man. And then, in the same episode, having used the mind meld to plant a virus and hijack the agent's body, Rick turns and dismisses the whole thing. He calls the Diane and Beth origin story, in effect, completely fabricated. He tells us the tragedy we just watched never happened. So the show hands you a wound and then tells you the wound is a lie, and for years that was where it left you, unsure whether the defining pain of the main character was real or a manipulation he invented to move a Federation agent. Both readings lived at once. Maybe Rick is a widower who never recovered. Maybe Rick is a man who weaponizes a fake grief because it is useful. The ambiguity was the point, and the series sat in it comfortably, unwilling to say. Season 7 finally answers, and the answer is that the bombing was substantially true. In Unmortrican, the 5th episode of Season 7, which aired in November of 2023, the story is confirmed, though with a crucial correction to who did it. An alternate Rick, one who calls himself Rick Prime, killed Rick C-137's wife Diane and their daughter Beth with a bomb. The reason given is chillingly small for what it produced. Rick C-137 refused to hand over his portal technology, and Rick Prime denied it, destroyed his family in retaliation. The garage, the bomb, the two bodies, all real. What Rick dismissed as fabricated in Season 3 turns out to have been the truest thing he ever showed anyone, buried inside a lie about whether it was true. And Unmortrican adds a detail that reaches back and neatly explains an absence you may never have consciously noticed. Rick Prime did not stop at killing that one Diane. He later used a weapon called the Omega device to erase every version of Diane from every timeline across the entire multiverse. Consider the scale of that. In a show whose whole premise is that every person exists in endless variation across infinite dimensions, one woman, and only one, exists nowhere. That is the in-canon reason no alternate Diane ever appears anywhere in the series. Other characters have countless doubles. Diane has none, because a grieving man's murderer decided that if he could not have leverage over Rick, then Rick would not be allowed even the comfort of another Diane in another world. The erasure is the cruelty raised to the level of the multiverse itself. In that same episode, Rick finally gets what the entire series has been circling toward. He gets his revenge. He beats Rick Prime to death, and the series stages it as one of its most violent sequences, a long-delayed reckoning delivered with fists rather than science. After seasons of ambiguity about whether the loss was even real, We watch the man who caused it die at the hands of the man who never stopped carrying it. Whether that closes the wound or only empties it is left, as the show tends to leave things for you to sit with. There is one more thread that belongs in a recap like this, because it does to Beth what the potion episode did to the whole family, silently and permanently. In the ABCs of Beth, which premiered in September of 2017, Rick makes his daughter an offer. He will clone her. The clone will stay behind and raise her family in her place, and Beth herself will be free to leave Earth and explore the universe. Beth accepts, and the series, deliberately, refuses to label them. The two Beths are left unmarked, so that even in the moment it happens, it is unclear which one is the original and which one is the copy walking out the door. That uncertainty is then made total and made permanent in Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, the finale of Season 4. We learn that Rick went further than leaving the question open for us. He erased his own memory of it. After swapping the two Beth pods, he wiped from his own mind which one held the original and which held the clone. The consequence is that no one alive knows the answer, not even the man who built both of them, the Beth who stayed on Earth and the one who left, whom the series calls Space Beth, are now permanently interchangeable in the one place it might have mattered, which is Rick's own certainty. He gave up the knowledge on purpose, and so the question of which daughter is real joins the longer pattern of this show, where the real ones keep slipping out of reach. And that pattern is what this whole recap has been tracing, dot by dot. Look at what the family on screen actually rests on once you connect it all. The father and grandfather at the table are replacements who buried the originals in the yard in Season 1. The mother may be a clone, and even Rick cannot say. The real father's love for a real Diane was mocked as a lie, then confirmed as the truest thing in his life, then revealed to have been avenged only after her murderer erased her from all of existence. The original family that these people descend from, the Prime family, was hunted down to the last member and shot dead. Every warm domestic scene the series ever gave you was standing on top of at least one of these buried facts, and usually more than one at a time. That is why the reveal reframes every season before it, rather than simply adding to them. When you rewatch the early episodes now, knowing this Rick and this Morty walked in over two graves, the ordinary moments change temperature. A grandfather teasing his grandson is a man who replaced that grandson's real grandfather. A daughter desperate for her father's approval may be a copy, or the woman whose double is off in space, and her father chose not to know which. The show did not hide these things so much as it planted them and waited, trusting that the calm surface of a family sitcom would hold the audience long enough for the foundations to be built underneath. The dots were always there. This chapter has only walked from one to the next, in order, so that the line connecting them can finally be seen whole, and so that the quiet horror underneath the comedy has somewhere to rest. By the time the third season began, there was a question that had settled over everyone who watched this show closely, and it was not really a question about plot. It was a question about intention. Did the people who made Rick and Morty know, from the beginning, that Rick was carrying a dead wife and a dead daughter inside him, or did they discover that grief later and reach backward to plant it, the way a writer sometimes does when a character grows heavier than the jokes that first held him up? This is the oldest argument in serialized storytelling, the argument between planning and retconning, and what makes it interesting here is that the two men most responsible for the answer have spent years refusing to give a clean one. Consider what Dan Harmon told Polygon. He said that he personally believed the story of the wife and daughter killed by a bomb was Rick's real backstory, and that he had felt that way from around the time it first aired. His words were careful. He said he was happy making it appear fake, because he himself felt that was Rick's backstory and he liked it, but that he did not want to impose it at that early stage in the series' run. Think about what that admission actually contains. It is not the confession of a master plan. It is something softer and stranger, a creator holding a private belief about his own character while deliberately declining to force it onto the audience or even onto the writers who came after him. He knew, and he chose not to make his knowing official. That distinction between believing something and canonizing it is the entire subject of this chapter. Harmon eventually explained why he changed his mind about the withholding. He said that he ultimately chose to confirm the tragic backstory as definitive canon by the 6th season rather than keep teasing fans indefinitely, and he called the alternative a little abusive to fans. He was pretty comfortable, he said, calling that the truth. There is a whole philosophy of storytelling folded into that word, abusive. It suggests that ambiguity, past a certain point, stops being an artistic gift and becomes a kind of withholding that punishes the people who care most. Harmon seems to have decided that the tension he once protected had a shelf life, and that when it expired, honesty was kinder than mystery. Now set that beside what the series itself did, because the show behaved very differently from the man describing it afterward. In the premiere of Season 3, the episode called The Rick Shank Redemption, Rick sits before a Galactic Federation interrogator, and the flashback plays of his wife and daughter being killed by a bomb, and Rick tells the interrogator that this is a totally fabricated origin story. That single line did enormous work. It took the rawest image the series had ever shown and stamped the word fake across it, and it left the truth of Rick's past publicly ambiguous for years. A viewer walking away from that episode had genuine permission to believe either thing. Perhaps the grief was real and Rick was lying to protect himself. Perhaps the grief was invented and Rick was lying to escape. The episode gave you the wound and the denial of the wound in the same breath. It took until the 5th season finale, the episode called Rickmurai Jack, for the series to resolve which lie Rick had told. That finale confirmed that the traumatic memory Rick had shown the Federation back in Season 3 was factually real. He had lied only about it being fabricated, not about the underlying events. Pause on the precision of that. Rick did not fake the bomb, the wife, or the daughter. What Rick faked was the claim that he had faked them. The denial was the fiction. And so the line that had protected the ambiguity for years turned out to be, itself, the only false thing in the frame. The image was true. The word fabricated was the fabrication. The 6th season premiere, the episode called Solarix, took the confirmed backstory and pushed it outward into something larger. It revealed that the Rick who killed C-137's wife Diane and daughter Beth, the figure the series came to call Rick Prime, had deliberately inserted himself into a Smith family, and that the Morty the audience has followed all this time is Rick Prime's biological grandson, not a Morty naturally connected to C-137's original family line. This is where the private belief Harmon described finally becomes public architecture. The grief is not only real, it is load-bearing. It reaches down and reorganizes who the two central characters even are to each other. The tragedy stops being a piece of Rick's history and becomes the hidden hinge of the whole premise. So that is the show's own account delivered across 3 premieres and finales, moving steadily from denial toward confirmation. Against that, hold the second voice, the other man in the room. In a Reddit Ask Me Anything session in June of 2019, Justin Roiland was asked directly whether Rick's tragic origin story was real, and his answer was not an answer at all. He said, as best anyone recalls, that he genuinely did not know, treating the question as something that simply had not been settled either way. It is a lovely evasion, and it is worth weighing how different it is in spirit from Harmon's Polygon comments. Harmon spoke of a private belief he was choosing not to impose. Roiland spoke as though the truth genuinely did not exist yet, as though the story were a quantum system that had not collapsed into fact. One man knew and stayed quiet. The other framed the whole thing as unknowable even to its authors. And this goes beyond two personalities disagreeing. Newsweek reported that both Roiland and Harmon have said there is no fixed, predetermined master plan or locked-in backstory for Rick or Morty, and that some elements are deliberately left open rather than mapped out in advance. That reporting matters because it undercuts the neat version of events that fans often want, the version where a genius plotted everything from the pilot. The people who made the series have, on the record, denied that such a plan existed. Which means the answer to our opening question is closer to something in between. Harmon believed. Roiland shrugged. The writers left room, and the reveal that felt, in retrospect, so inevitable, was less a blueprint being executed than a possibility being slowly chosen. The way that third season arrived only deepened the strangeness. The Rick Redemption premiered unannounced on Adult Swim and on the network's website on the 1st of April, 2017, April Fool's Day, looping on air from 8 in the evening until midnight, with no prior confirmation of the exact release date. There is something fitting about a backstory whose central line is a lie premiering on the one day of the year built around deception. And because of that surprise release, the rest of the season did not resume its weekly airing until nearly 4 months later, at the end of July. So, the episode that told fans their tragic theory might be true, and then told them it was fake, dropped without warning, and then vanished for a third of a year, leaving the argument to boil in silence. That argument had been building before the episode ever aired. Nerdist later noted that fans had already been speculating that Rick must have some tragic hidden backstory, the loss of a family or a universe, to explain his emotional detachment and his long absences. The audience had, in effect, written the reveal before the series delivered it. They looked at a man who drank to forget and disappeared for decades, and reasoned backward to a wound large enough to account for him. When the flashback finally played, it did not so much surprise the fans as confirm a diagnosis they had already made. And the fans went further than feeling. They went looking for proof that the seed had been planted early, and the fan-run Wiki TV tropes gathered one of the details they cite most often. In the first season episode that put Rick on trial, Morty is never given a dimension designation, even though Rick is repeatedly called Rick C-137. Then, years later, in the Rick Redemption, when Morty states that his home dimension is C-137, the Citadel guard Ricks visibly react with surprise. To a community hunting for intention, that reaction is a smoking gun. It suggests the show always knew there was something irregular about this particular Morty. Something the guards found startling, long before Solarix would explain that he did not belong to C-137's original family at all. Whether that detail was foresight or coincidence is, in a sense, the perfect note to rest on, because it returns us to the divide we started with. The creators told us there was no master plan, and then the series behaved as though there might have been one all along, and the fans, standing between those two truths, built a theory sturdier than either man would openly endorse. Harmon believed privately and confirmed late. Roiland called it a cat in a box, and the audience, refusing the uncertainty offered to them, simply decided that the grief was real and waited, patiently, for the series to admit they had been right. So the case gathers, quietly, the way evidence does when no single piece decides it. The Rick who anchors our attention through all of this speaks of a family he chose after burying another, wears the wound of a wife and a daughter he could not save, and yet moves through his own dimension as though grief were a tool he had learned to hold at a distance. Consider how much of him refuses to fit the origin he gives. A man who claims to be the smartest across infinite realities, who insists on his own singular importance, keeps returning to a story about a garage and a green flash, and a version of himself he killed. Every certainty he offers arrives with a shadow standing just behind it. The portal gun, the Citadel, the endless copies wearing his face. All of it asks the same question without ever answering it, and the show lets that question sit in the room with us. Think about what it means that a character built on knowing everything cannot quite tell us who he is. He remains the man in the kitchen, pouring another drink, watching his grandchildren sleep in a house that is not the first house he called home. That image holds everything the smaller clues only gesture toward. A figure surrounded by family, and alone inside a history no one else can reach. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.